All right, so Joe Rogan caught a lot of flack over a podcast he did with Josh Szeps. One of the most popular YouTube videos regarding this topic is from David Doel with The Rational Nation. Here's a few of the highlights from his video about Joe Rogan.
Clearly, he knows a little bit more than Joe Rogan does about the vaccines. So I will get to the facts on this. There's been multiple studies on this showing that Rogan is wrong. The only reason Rogan should feel bad in this moment is that he has spread bullshit to millions of people. This is the issue. When you have a podcast and you don't know what the hell you're talking about, you are spreading lies to millions of people. Hopefully Rogan sits with this for a bit, realizes he was wrong, maybe comes out, admits he was wrong, informs his millions of listeners that he was wrong and what the reality is.
So yeah, pretty strong opinions from the Rational Nation, which I will show you is, I mean, all his conclusions are highly irrational. But let's go through the clip and see if there's any validity to what this guy's saying.
For young boys in particular, there's an adverse risk associated with the vaccine. It's like a 2 to 4-fold increase in the instances of myocarditis.
Yes, but you know what?
Hospitalization.
Keep in mind, Joe Rogan does a live podcast and talks to these guests for 3 to 4 hours with no stop and no knowing what could possibly come up. He's trying to recall reading this study from his mind and cite it. As you can see, the study is talking about healthy boys with no underlying conditions, ages 12 to 15. So the study that he's citing is from the University of California. They estimate the rate of myocarditis after 2 shots of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine to be 162.2 cases per million for healthy boys aged 12 to 15. And then 94 per million healthy boys 16 to 17. Again, Joe's he's thinking of the 12 to 15. At current U.S. infection rates, the risk of a healthy adolescent, so healthy being no underlying medical conditions, healthy adolescent being taken to a hospital with COVID in the next 120 days is about 44 per million. All right, so keep that in mind as we continue.
You know that there's an increased risk of myocarditis among that age cohort from getting COVID as well, which exceeds the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine.
I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true. No. I don't think it's true that there's an increased risk of myocarditis from people catching COVID that are young versus increased risk of myocarditis from the vaccine.
So here Joe tries to clarify and says, I don't believe that. And if anyone thinks there's a problem with that, there's a problem with the way that your brain works about how we should have discussions about things.
Myocarditis more common after COVID-19 infection than vaccination. But is this with children? 12 to 17 more likely to develop myocarditis within 3 months of catching COVID at a rate of 450 cases per million infection. This compares to 67 cases of myocarditis per million at the same time following their second dose of Pfizer.
Yeah, so you're about 8 times likelier to get myocarditis from getting COVID than from getting the vaccine.
That's interesting.
Now,
that is not what I've read before.
Okay, so this is not a denial of admitting that he's wrong. This is him trying to process, how is that possible? Because I have read before, I read before, that there is more risk in these young boys. He knows that he's read it. He's trying to understand it. This is not him needing to be right. Joe Rogan does not need to be right. He can admit he's wrong. He's an absolute stud. So the misunderstanding, Joe Rogan's talking about healthy boys 12 to 15 with no underlying conditions. Josh Szeps is talking about all kids 12 to 17. And here's where I have to really start taking issue. This guy from the Rational Nation gives the least rational explanation as to why Joe Rogan is spreading misinformation I could ever possibly think of.
Another study, this one's out of Israel, looked at 880,000 people. That's a lot of data for a study. 880,000 people, ages 16 and older.
Yeah, David, this would almost be interesting because it has so much data, except for the fact that none of the data, well, nearly none of the data is applicable. Joe Rogan and even Josh Szeps in his misunderstanding of what Joe Rogan's trying to say, they're talking about boys between 12 and 17.
There's been multiple studies.
So 2 important factors, males age 12 to 17. Your study, males and females, age 16 and above.
Spread bullshit.
This is how you disprove him. This is highly irrational. What should happen from this point forward, I will have you talk to yourself.
You are spreading lies to millions of people. This is the issue. When you have a podcast and you don't know what the hell you're talking about, you should be willing to accept the reality that you were wrong and be able to learn and move on. Hopefully,
You
sits with this for a bit, realizes he was wrong, maybe comes out, admits he was wrong, informs
hundreds of thousands
of listeners that he was wrong and what the reality is.
The Joe Rogan Experience.